For days, the inner city had been cordoned off, busy preparing for the large public ceremony for the proclamation of a new Chinese state, the People's Republic of China, PRC. Now, the great leader of the revolution, the maker of a new Chinese history, of New China, was about to be born, thoroughly remade by the elimination of exploitation, inequality, war, and other ills of the past. It would feature a new society without classes, a new culture for the common people, and a new wave of development that would benefit all sections of Chinese society. Ambitious state initiatives would reconfigure business ownership, landholding, marriage, the organization of work and daily life, and the very understanding of oneself, one's community, and one's past. The Cultural Revolution was the story of efforts to create a new China, ending dramatically in chaos, internal strife, confusion, isolation, and destruction. The history of the first 3 decades of the PRC is then a history of aspirations and betrayals, of new beginnings and hard landings, of experimentation and failure. The CCP chose not to call its system and society communist, but rather to use the word socialist. For the party, communism was to be a later stage in the development of Chinese society. It was also a rational system. Socialism was a transitory phase on the way to that utopia. Decisions and policies in the Mao era were broadly informed by the goals of communism and shaped by transfers from the Soviet Union, but building socialism did not take place in a historical vacuum. The CCP knew from its experiences in the border areas that to reach this goal, it would have to engage society and the Chinese people, building on pre-1949 practices. Society and economy in the PRC were reorganized in a unique way. Directives from the top echelons of the party reverberated through the large surface of the bureaucratic state and into a dense network of social organizations at the grassroots level. The need for such a system was recognized in the 1950s and resulted in the creation of a whole range of new institutions, introducing the party state, economic planning, state and party control over the cultural sector, social classification, and much grassroots organization of society. Many policies were sidetracked, compromised, or distorted, and some backfired. The escalating efforts to remake China led to 2 radically ambitious nationwide campaigns of rapid transformation, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Both claimed to reinvigorate the push to remake China and propel it into a new era. In reality, both inflicted massive destruction and loss, appending many of the achievements of the early 1950s socialist transformation, 1949 to 1955. After the government achieved military control over mainland China in 1949 and 1950. Only a year after the end of the Civil War, it mobilized troops again for military intervention in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, in support of its new North Korean allies. This costly and brutal war, at the end of 1950, nationwide mass campaigns were initiated to target domestic opposition and leftovers from the previous government. At the same time, in the rural areas, land reform was carried out. The media and publishing sector was brought under party control. One regime change, in December 1949, Stalin called Chinese communism nationalistic and accused Mao of being inclined toward nationalism. Stalin recognized the new government only hesitatingly. As early as 1948, he made a prediction: after victory, the Chinese government will be a national revolutionary and democratic government rather than a communist one. Doubts about popular acceptance also drove Stalin's and the Soviet advisors' constant urgings that the CCP should enter a coalition government with the third parties or democratic parties in China. Whatever sympathies it might have enjoyed among certain groups in the population on the eve of the revolution, the CCP did not have widespread support or acceptance. A fundamental lack of legitimacy marked the rule of the CCP from the very beginning. Forcing the Chiang Kai-shek government into exile in Taiwan did not make China communist. In the mid-20th century, China faced tremendous problems as a country that was not only huge but also very diverse. The prospects for a smooth transition to communism were slim. From 1949 to 1951, the mainland was effectively under martial law. Military control commissions governed China. China was divided into 6 large regions, excluding Inner Mongolia and Tibet, which were administered separately. 4 of these regions, the central south, eastern China, the northwest, and the southwest, were run by military administrative committees, whereas northern China and the northeast were already given civilian people's governments in light of their successful conclusion of military consolidation. Once the CCP had restored basic order, it started surveying the existing landscape of organizations and social groups. For instance, a comprehensive report on the investigation of charity organizations in Jin categorized each of these relief organizations according to their role and social backing and divided them into 4 categories: institutions conducive to people's welfare, relief institutions with feudal characteristics, purely reactionary feudal and superstitious institutions, and charities that promoted religious propaganda. The reform and dismantling of organizations followed a differentiated and gradual approach. Associations or organizations that were deemed to benefit the people, such as schools, orphanages, followed. New papers were founded under CCP control. By contrast, superstitious sects and secret societies in the business of disseminating feudal superstitious ideas and persistently carrying out counter-revolutionary activities were to be dissolved without exception. The CCP was determined to suppress urban secret societies. Most foreign organizations likewise had to cease operations and leave the country. Some foreign-owned charities and enterprises were confiscated outright or accused of wartime collaboration with the Japanese and seized on that basis. The vast majority of foreigners left China voluntarily, and the rest were deported. In 1950 to 1951, similar approaches were also taken toward the numerous occupational and worker groups. Workers were heralded in official pronouncements as masters of the country, and the leading class that should rightfully take charge. Trade union organizations were established in urban factories immediately following their takeover by CCP authorities. The trade unions enjoyed considerable prestige and influence as official representatives of the working class. They were even permitted to set up their own armed patrols to guard factory grounds and carry out inspections. In June 1950, the All-China Federation of Trade Unions subsumed the many independent trade unions. The new authorities found other ways to curb traditional vices by forcibly re-educating prostitutes, gamblers, and drug addicts to become productive members of society. After 1949, police had unfettered power to detain and convict criminals. The new government was also keen to tackle the problem of speculation and market manipulation by financial capitalists and fraudsters. It worked vigorously to stamp out currency fraud, especially in the form of counterfeiting. In short, the new government's takeover in 1949 and 1950, especially of the cities, displayed a relatively high degree of planning, intensive preparation, and systematic execution. To govern China, Mao argued that the Chinese Revolution historically fell into 2 stages, democracy and socialism. The former was a special Chinese type of democracy to be called New Democracy. In this period preceding the establishment of socialism, the new government would be required to manage a coalition of 4 progressive social forces. These were the same that constituted the United Front of the Yan'an era: the proletariat, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. This coalition of social classes would be under the leadership of the Communist Party. The calculation behind the policy was that the alliance of the CCP with local or national capitalists would avoid economic collapse and allow the CCP to draw on urban support. The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which convened in Beijing during September 1949, adopted 3 documents: the Common Program of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the Organic Law of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and the Organic Law of the Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China. During the period between 1949 and 1953, the Common Program provided the fundamental framework for the legal development in the PRC, while the 2 organic law documents outlined the formal structure of the future Chinese government. The conference named Mao as the new head of state and determined the membership of the government council. Mao Zedong, in fact, now dominated all three institutions: party, army, and government. He also enjoyed enormous popular standing, enhanced by his still-growing cult of personality. The PRC set up a Soviet-style governing structure that provided for overall control by the CCP. The party organization was at the core of the new state. At every level of government, decision-making power was in the hands of the CCP. At the top was the CCP Politburo. The Politburo had a standing committee that usually had between 5 and 9 members. This was the most important decision-making body and presumably met once a week. The Politburo was part of the larger Central Committee. The Central Committee meetings were used to discuss policy. Members of the Central Committee were elected by the National Party Congress. Theoretically, this was the body with the highest authority, yet its size and infrequent conventions made it more of a platform for announcing policies and top appointments. The National Party Congress met only rarely. Reporting to the Central Committee were party committees on the provincial level. Party secretaries, the top officials in each province, headed these provincial committees and met regularly with the smaller standing committees on the provincial level. The same structure was replicated at each lower level of government, all the way down to the grassroots, where municipal and prefectural party committees, and below, county and city district party committees, were established. Party committees also existed in every rural commune, every university, every factory, and every residential neighborhood. This nationwide network of party committees exercised supervision and control over administrative processes at each level. By 1954, the People's Representative Congress passed a constitution that affirmed the political primacy of the CCP and, in effect, legitimized the PRC as a one-party dictatorship. The constitution was patterned on the 1936 Soviet constitution adopted under Stalin. It also chose the State Council, the highest governing body headed by a premier. The State Council served as an executive governing body, like a cabinet, with several ministries and commissions reporting to it. The premier, the commission heads, and the ministers made up the State Council. In the 1950s, Mao Zedong was chairman of the CCP and president of the PRC, Liu Shaoqi was chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, and Zhou Enlai served as premier of the State Council. These three were the highest leaders. In practice, however, the distinction between state and party was relatively meaningless because government leaders almost always held simultaneous appointments in both the party and the state. Since their party institutions and governmental structures are closely intertwined, communist regimes are often described as party states. China was based on a single hierarchical institutional structure subordinate to the top leadership in Beijing and faithfully carrying out directives from the top echelon. On the local level, the CCP had little choice but to retain most government personnel from the previous regime. Already stretched too thin, it could not bring in enough new people to replace existing staff throughout the structure of Chinese government. These holdover staff, however, had to undergo political re-education and lessons in the New Democracy program, a process that was also called thought reform. During its first years, the CCP was unable to create and stabilize its new political institutions with an overwhelmingly new elite. Instead, for a long time, it had to rely on existing elites. Establishing new effective forms of governing was of central concern to the party, and in general, it followed Soviet models. 3. China and the Cold War. Ever since the European expansion in the early modern period, China had occupied an important strategic position in the world. Global powers had tried, but ultimately failed, to influence and control it. China managed to defend its independence even when under attack in World War II. At the same time, China could not isolate itself. Foreign assistance was seen as crucial for both economic development and security, so it needed constantly to align itself with international partners and supporters. During the Cold War, this task was greatly compounded. It became apparent that rivalry between the world's big powers, especially the Soviet-American confrontation, had a profound effect not only on China's international standing but also on its internal development. The United States had adopted an increasingly hostile attitude toward the CCP and started to actively support the GMD. Thus, the CCP had sought to break with the West and enter into an official alliance with the Soviet Union. Although the relationship between the CCP and Moscow in the 1930s and 1940s had never been easy, both parties decided to leave this legacy of distrust behind when they placed Sino-Soviet relations on a new footing in 1949 to 1950. On February 14, 1950, China and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance, in which the Soviets pledged to defend China from attacks by Japan and her allies, meaning the United States, and provide military and civilian assistance. They also agreed to transfer the Russian concessions in Manchuria, obtained in 1945, back to China. In return, the Chinese side accepted the independence of Outer Mongolia and promised that no other country but the Soviet Union would be allowed to operate in Manchuria and Xinjiang. The two sides also decided to establish a number of joint stock companies in sectors from food canning to aviation. During Mao's visit to Moscow to negotiate the contract, Stalin also agreed to China's wish for a 5-year, $300 million loan. This was used to fund 50 key industrial and infrastructural projects intended to speed up the development of Chinese heavy industry, defense industry, and energy production. The consequences of aligning to one side were far-reaching and can hardly be exaggerated. China became part of a larger web of cooperative relationships with all the brother countries of the socialist bloc. In numerous respects, the new state in China was closely modeled on Eastern European and, above all, Soviet experiences. Roughly 10,000 Russians arrived in China to serve as expert advisors, mainly from 1953 to 1957, and quite a few remained until Nikita Khrushchev abruptly pulled them out in 1960. Soviet advisors were attached to all Chinese ministries, regional and provincial governments, and major industrial enterprises. China learned from the Soviet Union in many areas, including how to set up a central party apparatus to run a government rather than a war, how to manage government ministries, how to create a system of courts, procurators, police, and jails, how to embed political security functions into factories, universities, offices, and other work units, and how to set up Soviet-style mass organizations. The organization of the New People's Liberation Army was consciously and directly founded on that of the Soviet Army. Soviet educators also devised the Chinese system of higher education. In foreign policy, China sought close alignment with Eastern Bloc policies. The CCP was convinced that it was locked in a pitched battle against imperialism and capitalism and that its security depended on a close political and military alliance with the communist camp led by the Soviet Union. As early as January 1950, when Mao Zedong met Stalin in Moscow, the two emphasized their mutual determination to provide assistance to the North Korean Communist regime. In mid-May 1950, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung met with Mao in Beijing, wherein he told the CCP's leadership that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had approved a military plan for a southern advance to reunify Korea. Although Mao urged caution, he promised undivided support to North Korea and declared that China would provide troops should the United States intervene. On June 25, 1950, troops from Communist North Korea, with Stalin's approval, crossed the 38th parallel, which had been established as the border between North and South Korea, and invaded South Korea, which was backed by the United States. North Korean forces moved south in a swift push that forced the South Korean and U.S. forces into the southeast area around Pusan. 2 days later, on June 27, the United Nations agreed to provide assistance to the retreating South Korean forces, resulting in orders issued to the U.S. 7th Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Strait. Through the summer of 1950, North Korean forces advanced and occupied almost the entire peninsula. As UN troops landed in South Korea, China requested that the United States not intervene. This request was not heeded. Successive military victories brought the UN troops up to the 38th parallel. Following this, the decision was made by the American military leader, five-star General Douglas MacArthur, to cross it and approach the Chinese-Korean border along the Yalu River. MacArthur had his own broad and ambitious agenda. He wanted to expand the Korean War to the point of moving against China. He felt that the momentum of the recent victories and the progress of American troops on the Korean peninsula provided a unique chance to undo communism in China by increasing pressure on the Chinese leadership. This step provided both a trigger and a justification for Beijing's entrance into the Korean War. China responded by again issuing a warning and beginning to mobilize troops, but Mao and the other Chinese leaders hesitated, and weeks of internal debate among the CCP leadership followed before troops were sent into battle. Many in the leadership felt the ongoing military campaign against Taiwan should take priority over Chinese involvement in Korea. On October 2, in a reversal, Mao informed Stalin that China was not able to send sufficient troops to Korea. In his stern reply, Stalin warned of the severe consequences of Chinese inaction in the future. He cautioned China would have to deal with 2 American bases in Korea and Taiwan along its borders and would find itself under constant threat. He also insinuated that China could no longer count on Soviet aid. In another surprising change of position, the Chinese Politburo decided on October 5, in principle, to follow Stalin's policy and to send divisions of so-called volunteers to North Korea's rescue. But by mid-October, the leadership had still not set the troops in motion. After weeks of faltering, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, commanded by the remarkable military strategist Peng Dehuai, initiated its first campaign in Korea on October 25, 1950. In a surprise for U.S. military leaders, it attacked South Korean troops in the Unsan area. For 6 days, the Chinese volunteers fought alone. The Russian Air Force flew its first mission in support of the CPVA only on November 1, much to the frustration of Chinese leaders who had been promised vigorous Russian air support for the Chinese combatants on the ground. Consequently, the North Koreans, aided by Chinese troops, drove the UN forces all the way back to Seoul. UN forces began a counteroffensive in mid-January, taking the CPVA leadership by surprise. In April 1951, at the height of the Korean War, American President Harry Truman shocked American politics and surprised the world with his decision to remove Douglas MacArthur, whom he accused of unilaterally escalating the conflict. A ceasefire was signed in summer 1951. An armistice agreement was signed on July 23, 1953, between the United States, China, and North Korea, dividing the 2 Koreas at the same border as before. The outcome of the Korean War was naturally presented to the Chinese people as a victory, but it came at tremendous cost. Some 600,000 Chinese were killed and perhaps another 400,000 wounded. Scarce resources needed for China's reconstruction had been diverted to the war effort, away from other programs that urgently needed government investment. In 1951, military expenditures took up 55% of overall government spending. From late 1950, resources for local relief efforts in the still ailing Chinese cities and for social welfare were significantly constrained by the heavy demands imposed by the Korean War. Grain, meat, and cotton were needed to supply the army of volunteers fighting in Korea. The war also brought personal loss to Mao, whose oldest son, Mao Anying, was killed in the conflict. Casualties for all sides were high. Over 36,000 Americans, 520,000 North Koreans, and 400,000 South Koreans are estimated to have been killed on the battlefield. In terms of human lives, then, this conflict was the 3rd costliest war of the 20th century, outdone only by the World Wars. In fact, China's initial commitment faltered. It was Stalin who pressured China into entering the war. Anxious not to lose Soviet support that was seen as indispensable, the Chinese leadership gave in to his demands. Once China had intervened, however, its war effort had important and unforeseen consequences. First, China established itself as a rising international power that was able to hold its own against far superior American forces. Because it showed determination in defending its territorial safety and safeguarding a neighboring allied communist country, its prestige and its influence in the Eastern Bloc were greatly increased. Soviet leadership, perhaps for the first time, saw China as something more than a dependent satellite. Second, China reinforced its role as a protector and defender of non-Western countries. It would go on to support the Viet Minh in its war against the French and later help the North Korean and North Vietnamese communist governments. It worked, too, with insurgents in Africa and Latin America. Third, waging war also allowed the CCP to consolidate the rule it needed to mobilize the Chinese population for a total transformation of Chinese society. The Korean War also affected the situation across the Taiwan Strait. By the end of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD government had fled to Taiwan and successfully rebuffed an attack of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, on the offshore islands in September 1949. It had also established a new administration and instituted a set of reform policies that were winning local support. The outbreak of the Korean War, however, unexpectedly changed the situation. Mao now had to concentrate China's resources in Korea, postponing any attack on Taiwan. Moreover, war on the Korean peninsula prompted the United States to quickly resume its relationship with Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD government. That relationship grew closer in the 1950s and led to the 1954 signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty, not only securing the military survival of the GMD in Taiwan but also creating the foundation for the U.S. economic assistance that would play an outsized role in the reconstruction and development of Taiwan. For cleaning up in the city as in the countryside, the CCP wanted to create a new society. To achieve such transformation, the CCP began its task of purifying society. It devised methods to supervise or remove parts of the population deemed unreliable or hostile to the new authorities. Having just overthrown the GMD regime by means of war, the CCP believed it was still at risk when both the remnant forces of the GMD and hostile groups in local society put up resistance throughout China. Even after the establishment of the PRC in October 1949, at least 600,000 of the GMD rearguard remained on the mainland, and numerous special service agents, left behind by secret police units of the nationalist government, hid throughout China. In fact, it took until the end of 1950 for the CCP to establish full control over the mainland. The new authorities warned sternly that these nationalist remnants might collaborate with gangsters and criminals to undermine the new order. As soon as the new public security bureaus were constituted under communist leadership, announcements were made at the command of the Military Control Committee. Reactionary organizations were against the law, all special service units were to be dissolved, their members would be registered, and their illegal weapons and radio transmitters would be seized. The crime of counter-revolution was defined in the statutes of the State Administrative Council and the People's Supreme Court concerning the suppression of counter-revolutionary activities, dated July 1950. And the 21 articles of that statute on punishment for counter-revolutionary activity, dated February 1951. The term counter-revolutionary activity was only vaguely defined as any activity that aims at overthrowing or undermining the democratic dictatorship of the people and the socialist system. This, therefore, put the PRC in harm's way, and for many, it was the death penalty. It was in this vague climate of war, fear, and suspicion, and with the specific intention to purge society of unreliable, hostile, or counter-revolutionary elements, that the CCP launched its nationwide campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, lasting from 1950 to 1953. Its main intention was to strengthen and defend the CCP's grip on power. The campaign ordered suspected former members of the GMD or its organizations, alleged nationalist spies, and former members of the nationalist military or secret police to register with the police at their place of residency. The campaign also attacked gang leaders, drug smugglers, and religious sect leaders. Many of them were killed. Therefore, it is not surprising that the campaign was violent. In less than 1 year, the counter-revolutionary campaign led to the deaths of 72,000 people, the convictions of 1.3 million people, the sentencing of 1.2 million to forced labor, and the arrest and subsequent re-education of another 380,000. Endowed with broad legal powers to take action against suspected enemies, the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries relied heavily on people's tribunals or military courts for its implementation. Mass tribunals can be traced back to the period of the revolution before 1949, when they were instrumental to the fight against the CCP's enemies. People's tribunals, first introduced in 1950 in the early years of the PRC, were one of the most important levers by which the new government wielded state power, bypassing the formal court system. People's tribunals, in cooperation with public security and party organizations, often carried out massive purges. People's tribunals deployed devices such as mass trials and accusation meetings. Three specific formats were widely used in the process: the accusation meeting, the big meeting to announce the sentence, and the mass trial. Each form could involve up to tens of thousands of people. They were organized in a way that sought to best mobilize the populace, educate through negative example, and deter through public punishment. Those who served as material witnesses were not only thoroughly rehearsed in what they were to say and when, but carefully chosen in the first place for the degree to which they would excite the sympathies of the crowd. In 1952, the party attempted to discipline China's capitalists and private entrepreneurs by launching the Five Anti-campaign. This time, outlining an anti-bribery, anti-tax evasion, anti-fraud, anti-theft of state property, and anti-leakage of state economic secrets agenda, designed to discipline the party state and to consolidate unified central leadership over the urban economic sector. Pan Hongyan, vice mayor of Shanghai and former chief of CCP intelligence, was accused in the spring of 1955 of historical crimes in public. It was claimed that he had, in the 1940s, sought cooperation with the Japanese Secret Service organs and had been colluding with the major traitor Wang Jingwei. Together with the writer Hu Feng and others, he was indicted for organizing a counter-revolutionary clique. These revelations triggered another, even broader campaign against counter-revolutionaries. This campaign, known as the Campaign for the Elimination of Counter-Revolutionaries, lasted 5 years and involved the exposure and criticism of roughly 20 million people in factories, residential units, and government agencies. Millions of arrests were made by the police, the army, or people acting on behalf of the party, without any involvement of the regular courts. Hundreds of thousands of class enemies, or enemies of the people, were sentenced to death in these campaigns and executed. Mao himself set a quota for executions to be carried out, believing that counter-revolutionaries deserving death made up 0.1 to 0.2% of the population, between 500,000 and 1 million people. According to reports by the Public Security Bureau, in the 12 years between 1950 and 1962, almost 10 million people were arrested by central authorities for being counter-revolutionaries or bad elements, and roughly 1.6 million of these were executed. Many more were sent to labor camps by local authorities, factories, counties, and communes, which had the power to enforce law and impose sentences. By 1962, at least 4 million counter-revolutionaries or bad elements had been sentenced to labor reform or laogai, meaning that they were sent to labor camps, re-education centers, or work sites, kept under surveillance. The number who died from starvation and disease exceeded 500,000. With the campaigns generating so many arrests, the government had an urgent need to build a more extensive labor camp system. Around the start of the suppression campaign in May 1951, the PRC's labor camp system was founded. Laogai slowly and inexorably assumed a prominent economic role to the benefit of the socialist state. By assigning prisoners to dangerous, difficult, and exhausting work projects, the state offered some relief to the peasants and workers whose support it needed. The full exploitation of prison labor cut the state's expenses, and the threat of being sent to the camps helped discipline the civilian workforce. Just how many people were serving sentences from 1951 to 1959 is unknown, but the number of arrests suggests the number was likely around 20 million. The death penalty was often carried out immediately or the next day. Most executions were public. These public displays of excessive violence had a profound impact on society. It showed unequivocally what the class struggle ultimately entailed. Reckless arrests and executions, carried out regardless of whether there was clear evidence of wrongdoing, were common. It became apparent that campaigns were being used by many local individuals and groups, such as cadres and militias, to settle old scores with neighbors and to decide long-term local conflicts in their favor. By the time the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries ended in 1953, the government had created 170,000 resident security committees, with an activist base numbering more than 2 million people, operating under the leadership of the local public security agencies. In work units, villages, and towns, the activists had a combined strength that allowed them to stretch across all facets of life and to protect the social order right down to the street and work unit level. Their reach also enabled them to help the police efficiently monitor any suspected or minor counter-revolutionaries within their own work and living spaces. The residence committees had two seemingly contradictory roles: promoting grassroots democracy and serving as a tool for stability maintenance and mass mobilization. Their close cooperation with local public security bureaus and local party organizations meant that the committee's neighborhood activists were able to translate government policy into pervasive and powerful public pressure. Government and party organizations, state-owned enterprises, financial institutions, and educational establishments were all termed danwei. Typically, a danwei supervised almost all aspects of life for its employees. Housing, healthcare, recreational activities, ration goods, and pensions were all organized through the danwei. The danwei-based welfare system was codified in February 1951 with the passage of the National Labor Insurance Regulations. The regulations set out both the tasks and responsibilities to be covered by the danwei system and the methods for financing it. According to the regulations, the workers were entitled to make use of various selective welfare services offered by the danwei, such as sanatoriums, kindergartens, homes for the aged, orphanages, institutions for the disabled, and holiday facilities. Danwei employees were entitled to lifetime employment but were not allowed to change danwei through their own initiative. The danwei also served as the keeper of the personal files that followed individuals from primary school throughout their lives. The files came to include school records, party membership, promotions and performance evaluations, and family history, as well as detrimental information such as any negative evaluations by superiors, written criticism, and warnings. The danwei also engaged in a variety of political activities under party leadership and supervision. Most importantly, the danwei had to implement the political campaigns devised by the central authorities by organizing meetings, discussing policies, and mobilizing members. The violence and pervasiveness of the political mass campaigns succeeded in destroying most underground remnants of GMD forces. Whatever armed insurgencies, attacks, or acts of sabotage might have been attempted by the opponents of New China were almost completely forestalled. Thus, the CCP's campaigns achieved their primary goal, even as they also created a system for effective grassroots mobilization and established a host of new institutions to reorder social and political life. 5. A culture made new. The party's view of the cultural and intellectual life that had flourished in China before 1949 was that it was part of an obsolete and vanishing world. The work, beliefs, habits, and lifestyles of intellectuals, writers, artists, and professors were profoundly contaminated by their privileged upbringing, sophisticated education, and lavish ways of life, which had imbued them with disdain for workers and peasants, bourgeois political ideas such as liberalism, deeply pro-American values. Given their political predilections, some even secretly supported the Nationalist Party or other political parties and undermined CCP rule. Even those who were indifferent to politics and refused to participate in political movements were nonetheless, for the party, roadblocks to the building of socialism. After 1949, the military control commissions gradually established culture and education management committees, consisting of various bureaus. Together, these bureaus were to organize the takeover of the cultural and education sectors, including theaters, film companies, the broadcasting industry, media print publishing, schools, and universities. But from 1953 onward, private publishing houses faced tightening restrictions. The PRC General Administration of Press and Publication and the Cultural and Educational Committee of the State Council of the PRC in the central government took over control of the press and publishing industry and stipulated that after January 1953, newspapers, periodicals, and publishing houses had to apply for licenses to stay in business, forcing private publishers to terminate or change their business, incorporating private publishers into joint state-private entities. After 1953, no private newspaper and publisher remained in business. Only books approved by the government were distributed in the Xinhua stores. From 1955 to 1956, the Ministry of Culture pursued an extensive and harsh program to take reactionary, pornographic, and ridiculous old books off the market because they propagated corrupt and reactionary thoughts and shameless lifestyles. These books had to be removed or replaced. Publishers had to cut many titles from their back catalogs and take them out of circulation. Any newly purchased books had to come from government-run Xinhua bookstore outlets. New popular art and literary forms were used for two purposes: to demonize enemies of the party and to acclaim the new socialist regime. Private ownership of press, publishing, and media was thus converted into government ownership, and state control was established over the entire sector. In literary and arts publications, there was a push to create and publish new literature geared toward workers, peasants, and soldiers. A large majority of the publications were political in nature and guided by the editorial principle of promoting communist ideals. Even poems did not escape party politics. Newspapers and their literary supplements started publishing serialized works only by well-known CCP leaders or writers and artists close to the CCP. Also under pressure were those in education and academia. The system of higher education was reorganized, meaning that various universities were reshuffled and merged. The sector as a whole was expanded. From 1949 to 1961, total enrollment in the universities and colleges in China's mainland rose from 117,000 to 961,623. Here again, the process also facilitated the extension of central government control throughout the system, at the expense of local governments and private institutions. The new government spurred the transformation of cultural and educational institutions, but it also demanded the allegiance of students, teachers, scientists, and writers, who had to demonstrate their loyalty. The start of a nationwide thought reform campaign can be dated to the summer of 1951, when Peking University organized political study classes for the faculty and staff and received Mao Zedong's enthusiastic support. The Ministry of Education then proposed similar activities for universities and post-secondary schools nationwide. By September, over 6,000 college faculty and staff in Beijing and Tianjin had been put through month-long study programs. In October 1951, Mao Zedong called for a campaign of self-education and self-reform on the educational and cultural fronts and among various types of intellectuals. They were asked to examine their political convictions and to identify those mistaken or false elements in their own beliefs, political activities, job performances, and lifestyles that did not correspond with the standards and models promoted by the party. They were urged to confess acts of corruption, waste, and other improper or unlawful conduct. Their ideas, attitudes, and behavior were then subjected to intense criticism by others and official investigation. For the CCP, the re-education of intellectuals through political study, confession, and criticism was not the only objective of thought reform. The party was also keenly interested in gathering and storing data on individual backgrounds, so that it could gain control over the cultural sector. As the educated elite was regimented and absorbed into the state bureaucracy, it lost creative and intellectual freedom. 6. Land reform. Land reform was perhaps the most important socio-political goal of the CCP. Through a redistribution of the land, a more egalitarian society could be created that would eliminate rural poverty and economic inequality. The CCP also pursued other goals, however, such as establishing central control over the countryside and increasing tax revenues from China's huge agricultural production. The Land Reform Campaign was launched in June 1950, on the eve of the Korean War, with the passage of the Land Reform Law. It ended around the same time the truce was declared on the Korean peninsula. This land reform was carried out nationwide and extended to southern regions, where there had been no previous experience of social reform in the countryside and where communist power was almost non-existent. Its main aim was still to confiscate the landholdings of the landlords and to distribute them among the poor peasants. Land reform measures were inherently violent, and this violence was exacerbated by fears of counter-revolution generated by the Korean War. Work teams fanned resentment and turned local conflicts into class struggle. Many landlords and rich peasants were executed, and their families were assigned to undergo reform through labor in the Poor Peasants' Associations or Laogai, labor under surveillance, by the village government. Indeed, more than 30 million people were forced to work under such surveillance. In many cases, violence was carefully orchestrated to follow clear, prearranged patterns. Dramatic devices were efficiently used to engage the emotions of the crowd, stir up resentment against targeted groups, and mobilize villagers to enact the reform. After land reform, the poor peasants, who made up more than 57% of the rural population, owned almost half of China's land. Rich peasants and landlords were the main target of land reform, and they were practically eliminated as a social group. In many areas, a major aim of land reform appears to have been the final destruction of the traditional rural social structure. Traditional institutions relying on estates, such as lineage halls and temples, were annihilated. Furthermore, poor peasants did not have enough capital and labor at their disposal to make efficient use of the newly allotted land. Land that was redistributed often produced less than it had before. Many areas were also too impoverished to engage in land reform, and existing plots could not be made productive due to the lack of tools and fertilizers. In the end, while land reform generated significant changes in the structure of land ownership, it failed to realize its goal of a more egalitarian society in the countryside. Poor peasants, including a growing number of new rural cadres, became disillusioned and complained that the promises of revolution had not been kept. Land reform changed the relationship between the state and rural society. Because of land reform, many land holdings that previously had not been reported to tax collectors were measured and assessed. Once it was determined how much each plot was able to produce, it was possible to specify the amount of grain that had to be given to the state as tax. Land reform thus helped the government increase the area of taxable land and bring in new revenues. Land reform also had significant social consequences. Members of work teams later became cadres in local villages, holding significant positions of power. The implementation of land reform was far from smooth, and resented higher tax payments and party control. In many places, peasants refused to fully cooperate. When peasants started to criticize the government or refused to deliver their full grain quotas, cadres were helpless and saw no option but to resort to violence or coercion to carry out land reform. Problems also arose from the fact that the government pursued a single, strict policy that was applied throughout the whole country. Yet, conditions in China were very diverse. Northern villages had economic and social structures that were very different from villages in the south. Some mountainous areas or poor regions could barely support a few rich peasants, let alone sustain a landlord class. The government and the party soon came to the conclusion that the peasants were not as revolutionary as they had assumed. They would have to be brought along by thought reform and education movements aimed at thorough changes of everyday culture. Culture production, everyday life, division of labor, and social hierarchy would all have to become more conducive to revolution. The people needed to be turned into state peasants. The countryside had to be entirely remade by eradicating feudalist exploitation.
在本节目结束之前，如果您感到满意，请订阅本频道。您的订阅就是对我每天努力制作节目的最大支持。让我们一起传播真相，了解世界和中国真实的历史文化和现实政治的进程。谢谢大家观看。